Okay, today we're going to talk, I have 6 sort of topics. I don't know if I'll get through all of them. All still in chapter 2, but I think I'm going to finish chapter 2 today. The topic that I'm going to attempt to avoid and reserve for next week is male and female, the sort of question of sexuality. I know last week I said I'd probably talk about it this week, but there was enough material this week to sort of fill up the time that I kind of want to just push it off that topic, leave it just sort of all for next week, because it kind of can be an interesting sort of lead into the question of the fruit that they ate and the sin and all that. So let me make this point first. And I said this a few weeks ago, and I promised that I would talk about it later, and now I am fulfilling my promise. That there's a distinction between good and evil, and good and bad. And this is a distinction I'm going to make right now at the beginning, because we're going to talk about this tree of the knowledge of, and then it's going to be one of these, and we have to sort of ask which one of these is the Hebrew referring to. So first I'm going to make the distinction, and then we'll talk about which one this knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and, it's going to be bad, I'm going to tell you right now. This is the thing that the tree is knowledge of. Okay, it's good as knowledge of. So what's the distinction? This is the distinction you find in late 19th century writers recovering a kind of ancient kind of linguistic distinction. We don't make it in our language today, I think, because of imprecision, but there is a difference. And I can give it the sort of typical sort of popular Catholic way to make this distinction is evil is referring to a moral issue. So good and evil is, is this act good or evil? Was that a good act or was it an evil act? Good and bad, well, all kinds of stuff is bad that's not evil, right? The weather is bad, but the weather's not committing a sin. You see that? And so good and bad has to do with good for you or bad for you. Sort of like anything that's sort of negative is we sort of describe as bad. I'm having a bad day, but that doesn't mean that the day committed a sin.
Bad
You see what I mean?
habits.
What is it?
Bad eating habits.
Bad eating habits. Yeah, that can even be immoral, but sometimes not. Yeah. Good. So you guys get that first distinction? So that actually kind of changes a lot, because a lot of things. You ever watch the like YouTube atheist? You ever watch the YouTube atheist? It's kind of funny. It's like a 14-year-old kid that thinks he's going to ask questions that nobody has ever thought about in thousands of years. And they'll ask this question, well, how could God condemn Adam and Eve for doing an evil act when they didn't know good and evil until after they ate the fruit? And then you're supposed to be like, wow, you blew my mind. I don't believe in anything anymore because you asked that question. This will help go a big way towards clearing that up. The tree is not the knowledge of, the tree is not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as if sin is the thing that they're learning, or that's the knowledge of what is it for something to be good morally and evil morally. Okay? It's actually a much wider or broader thing. Knowledge of good and bad. Now, what exactly does that mean, and what the temptation was, is the thing that's going to be interesting and going to be kind of sort of the main topic today. Actually, that's kind of the next thing that I want to talk about. Let's look at the command. So we have the name of the tree. So I'm going to erase this one. And it's the tree of knowledge of good and bad. And chapter 2, verse 16 has the commandment here. So let's see the commandment. The Lord God commanded the man, so this is before Eve is created, which is kind of an important thing. Before Eve is created, God tells Adam, okay, this man, here's the command. Thank you. You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall die. That's the text of the command. Okay. Now, first thing is really interesting. What does the command actually say? The biggest chunk of the command, or the first big chunk of the command, sorry, says, you may freely eat of every tree of the garden. So it's not that God is this sort of negative lawmaker saying what you're not allowed to do. On the contrary, the primary fundamental thing is you're allowed to do literally everything. You can eat of, don't take that too literally, but you can eat of any of these trees. I don't know, there were 1,000, 10,000 trees, whatever number there were. We're imagining the scenario. There's 1,000 trees you can eat from, and the command says you're allowed to eat from all of them. Any of the trees. Implying, actually close the door, I don't want to affect the way people are voting. For those of you watching, there's a voting booth down the hallway. So, totally lost my train of thought.
Implying, you're saying.
Imply, yeah, I did use that word. It doesn't help though.
There's all these trees around you.
All these trees, you're allowed to eat any of them. And so it's not this sort of crippling, I'm not allowed to do anything. I talk to people a lot who have kind of sensitive consciences, and they just kind of just feel like, oh my gosh, everything's a sin. On the contrary, unless it's forbidden, there's no negative, unless there's a negative constriction, you assume that it's allowed. So it's totally the wrong way to think about it, to say, well, does the Bible say that you're allowed to X or Y or Z? That's absolutely backwards. Absolutely backwards. And that's the same thing in the law of the church. The law of the church, it's not that unless the church explicitly says you're allowed to do something, then it's forbidden. It's totally the opposite. It's unless it's forbidden, you assume that it's allowed. That's the natural, that's the way, the very, very first commandment is phrased in that way. Everything is allowed. All these trees are allowed, except this one tree that's forbidden. Now let's look at a couple of these. There's a couple of sort of notes here that are worth looking at. First, that's the implies thing, I remember now. You're allowed to eat of any of the trees in the garden, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That implies that they're allowed to eat of the tree of life. Remember there were two trees? Look at verse 9. And he made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, and the tree of life also in the middle of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And God only commands not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So that means they're even allowed to eat of the tree of life. And we know from later on, after the fall, so-called fall, chapter 3, verse 22, I'm not going to get to that until like a month from now, but I just want to jump ahead real quick. The Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and bad. And now lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever, and he gets kicked out of the garden. So until that transgression of the command, they had access to the tree of life. Okay, so that's interesting.
Does the tree of life make you live up to 930 years like Adam?
You really love that, don't you?
Did it?
Yeah. I don't know. It's
So if I was
implied.
eating- Is it a fruit where I eat and I can live for life forever?
If I find it, I'll let you know.
Why did they call it the tree of life?
I don't know. We'll get to that next month, man. I told you. I'll tell you. One thing at a time. So first of all, we have to sort of ask this what this command is about.
Okay.
On the day that you eat of it, you shall die. This is another one of those internet atheist questions that they like. Well, they didn't die that day. They didn't die that day, which is a fact. So is God lying? And then you're supposed to go, oh man, I'm an atheist now because you asked it. There's a verse that's kind of hard to understand for a second. Okay, that's not what the Hebrew says, on the day that you shall eat of it. And then there's a phrase that Semitic languages have, there's a kind of idiom. On the day that you eat of it, dying you shall die. There's this construction, I think it's called the infinitive absolute construction, is the name that grammarians use. I was at lunch with Bishop Ibrahim in Michigan years and years ago. And I had my collar open like I always do, I have neck issues. So I had it open, and then it was like kind of cold outside, and I coughed, and then they started yelling at me, oh, yeah, that 1 inch of my neck is why I got a cold, right? So then the Bishop Ibrahim said, Dagum nagdagome. Okay, that's a phrase that we use in something like buttoning, button it. Okay, it's kind of to insist on it. What it meant in ancient Hebrew, according to these commentaries that I'm looking at, what it means that on the day that you shall eat of it, dying you shall die, that is the decree of a sentence. That is the decree of a judge. So what it means is, on the day that you shall eat of it, you will be condemned to death. It doesn't mean you will be put to death. That phrase, those words simply mean you will be condemned to death. That's the sentence, that's the consequence of this transgression. You guys see that? So there's these sort of questions that are legitimate questions, but they have answers, at least in these cases. Now, there's one thing that I don't have an answer for, but I want to draw to your attention in order to confuse you. Okay? And that is this. And again, I'm getting a little bit ahead here, but look at what Eve says on chapter 3, verse 3. See, she says to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, in the middle of the garden. Neither shall you touch it, lest you die." Now put aside the touching part first. I think it's very interesting. The tree of life is the one that's described as being in the midst of the garden. Right after that it says, "and the tree of knowledge of good and evil." But it looks like both of those trees were right in the middle of the garden. Tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it looks like Eve sort of either was confused or didn't have the same precise sort of language that was told to Adam. We're gonna talk about why that might be probably next week. But I just wanted to point that out. Eve thought that the tree in the middle of the garden was the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but that is the way that God described, that the narrator describes the tree of life. So does Eve have them mixed up? I don't know. We'll see. We'll think about that more next week.
Was it intentional that he placed it in the center?
Yeah, we'll talk about that next week. But yes, I think it was intentional. Yeah.
So he wanted them to violate the rule?
We'll see. We'll see. Yeah, I'm getting there. Okay, so so what could it mean? So now let's think about what is it that eating of this tree has these bad consequences. Let me repeat something that I said last week, or maybe the week before, or maybe both. I have to repeat this. It seems to me that the story that we have here is descriptive, not prescriptive. Do you remember that distinction I made? This is not a story about right and wrong. This is a story just explaining what is going on in life. Now, it's not until next week that we're going to see the consequences of this sin, but I'm going to tell you right now, ahead of time, these are not punishments. The stuff that happens after they eat of this tree are not punishments. They're just going back to the way the natural world usually is. So it's not as if the intention of God in creating the human being was that they were never going to die. And that when they ate the fruit, they sort of destroyed nature, and now suddenly they're mortal. Mortality is built into every living thing, every bodily living thing. Just the very fact of having a body implies that you can die. Because anything that's physical like this, you can cut it in half and then it's gone. Okay? So the punishment, even of death, that we call a punishment, is really just the consequence is just natural mortality. It's not this excessive thing that I'm going to destroy you because you did this horrible evil thing. Yeah.
So then how does that relate to, this might be a tangent, but how does that relate to Mary then? Because she didn't sin, and so if Adam and Eve did not sin, would they be immortal? Because I thought that's the truth.
It is. It's very much related to that. It's absolutely related to that. However, in the East, we have the feasts of the Dormition of Mary. So we believe that Mary died and resurrected like Jesus, actually, in the Eastern churches. But that part of it I don't want to get into so much, but it doesn't matter whether it's a consequence of sin or not. What I'm saying is that before eating of this tree, we can describe them as living in a state of grace. Grace. Okay? And what happens after the fall is they fall into a state of nature, and then sort of immediately or in the same sort of breath, a state of sin. But there is this sort of theoretical state of nature that's distinct from the state of grace as well as from the state of sin. Okay. This is a very, very muddy theological topic I don't want to get into, but that has to do with your question. So Mary would be here, and that's the kind of consequence of that would be she wouldn't have to sort of suffer these natural consequences. Now, let's go back to this. Knowledge of good and bad. So the implication, so that the story that we're being told, when we're told with this story as kids, and again, the way you teach kids is one way. The way you sort of teach adults to sort of read a text in a little bit more of a close way is two different things. What we're told as kids is, you see, there was a commandment, they disobeyed the commandment, they were punished. Therefore, wash the dishes. Okay? That's the way you teach a kid. I don't think that's exactly what's going on here. The author here is giving a command, and God is giving a command, and the transgression of this command is to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. What's implied here is this. What is it for them to break this command? It is for them to wish on their own to know what's best for them, to know what's good and bad for them as a matter of choice. The implication is this. It's not that they chose to do this evil, malicious thing. It's that they chose. And in the very act of choice, the consequences of humanity follow through. This is not about the punishment of a sin. This is about being a human being. And part of being a human being, I was talking about this last week, a sort of core part of being a human being is simply making a decision. And when you make a decision, when you make a choice for yourself, you are choosing good and bad. You're saying, well, right now I want, I got this water, or I have, I don't know, orange juice. I'm saying, you know what, right now, this water seems good to me. And then the orange juice, it doesn't seem as good. I don't feel like it. So it's sort of relatively bad. It's not that it's this immoral, evil sin. It's in making a decision, you are expressing your humanity. And in expressing your humanity and making a choice, humanity follows. All the other consequences of humanity follow, which we're going to read about in the next chapter. The consequences like awareness of your mortality, okay, or maybe mortality itself. Awareness of the hardship and difficulties and struggles of life. So the way I was saying this last week was, what is it? So the story is descriptive. It's trying to describe why human life is so difficult. And the answer is human life is difficult because of decisions, because of free choice. But it's not as if, that's why I always kind of shrug my shoulders. What if Adam and Eve hadn't eaten from the fruit? That's not what happened. And what would have happened if this, I think, blatantly ahistorical narrative was taken historically, and if it didn't actually even happen this way? I don't know. Remember I said last week somebody asked a question about something, and I said, I don't know, it's not there. And I don't know what would have happened. But what we're asking now, if we're interpreting this way, is what would humanity be like if there were no free will? And I think that's an incomprehensible question. I don't think there is such a thing as humanity without free will. I think that's what dogs are, or like monkeys or something like that. You know what I mean? So what it is to be human is to have this free will, and what it is to be human is to have this complexity and all these nasty consequences that come from choice. Now, what is this? So the issue here is choice, and what is this contrasted with? It's contrasted with instinct. Okay, so let's think about this, and I think you guys will kind of get a kind of intuition about what's really going on here. When you are walking along, and I don't know, there's like leaves in front of you. You guys don't have many leaves here in California, but let's say you have like dry leaves in fall, and you go and you sort of step on the dry leaves, and you hear the sound. It's like this. I like that sound. I don't know. And like you didn't even think about doing that. You know what I mean? You were walking in, and I don't know, these sort of very normal instinctual things that we don't even think about. I'm gonna drink up from this water bottle 5 or 6 times today without even even noticing that I did it. These are the things that we do by instinct without even noticing, without even paying attention to them. This is a life of a kind of innocence. The word innocence means not knowing. Okay? This is the Latin word nocere is to know, non-knowing. So just sort of not paying attention, just sort of having this kind of carefreeness that children very often have. I remember this is a stupid story I'm going to tell you, and I love this story. Okay? I was a priest, I was a seminarian, and I was living in Michigan still, and I was helping out at the First Communion classes, at St. Joseph's, one of the church that I grew up at. So I was helping teaching First Communion. And it was a hard time for me. It was my 3rd year in the seminary. I was trying to learn, Aramaic, and it was really not going well, and I was starting to learn philosophy and theology, and it was all these difficult questions, what were Adam and Eve doing before the fall, and all these kind of wrapping my mind around these, and I'm just really stressed out about everything and everything else. And there's difficulty. Any person following a vocation, there's sort of internal emotional difficulties as well. And in the midst of this, and then I'm teaching these kids, and that's stressful because they're loud and sticky. They always eating candy. Kids are always eating candy. And so in the midst of, so I teach whatever I teach, and I go outside, and I see this this little kid. It was the son of one of the moms that was coming to help, and she brought her even younger son, I don't know, 3 or 4 years old. I don't know what kids ages are but he was that old, and he's just sitting there on the step, looking out into an empty parking lot, and he's just eating Cheetos. That's it. He was just eating Cheetos, and I was blown away by that. Wow. You know what I mean? That's a beautiful, innocent, sort of quiet moment. He didn't need anything else. He wasn't worried about anything. He wasn't upset. He wasn't even complaining about not having something, like kids do sometimes. He was just sort of existing and just eating friggin' Cheetos. And that was it. He was content. Not thinking about anything at all. I was so that's kind of what's going on here. And a child is very capable of doing that because kids don't have to make these heavy choices. You know what I mean? But once we are in a situation in life where we start to have to make these choices, we're that much farther away from that sort of state of innocence. Is this sinfulness? Not at all. And that's kind of what I want to tell you about the story. This tree, God's saying, okay, don't eat from it because you shall not eat, for in the day you shall eat of it, dying you shall die. Mortality and this awareness of death comes from these choices that we have to make because we become aware of consequences. We become aware, oh man, even these little things that we have to make decisions for, like what you eat, the older you get, the choice of what to eat becomes more and more serious, right? When I was younger, actually some of you guys here remember this, David remembers this. When I was young, even 10, 11 years ago, when I was, seminary had just started, remember how I used to eat, man? Carl's Jr., 4 sandwiches, I would just down them one after the other. I'm not even, 2 big Carls, a couple of chicken sandwiches, finish those off, and then I would get a bowl of cereal and eat cereal in the middle of the night. And I was a little heavier than that, but I was fine. If I tried that now, you would never see me again. So a stupid choice like what you're going to eat has these serious consequences. And that's what this story is about. This story is about the fact of choice. And the fact is, it doesn't matter what you choose. Choosing well, okay, the consequences will be somewhat better, hopefully. But just the very fact of choice makes you aware of consequence, which in the end makes you aware of mortality. Somewhere down the line, mortality is waiting for you. Death is waiting for you. Okay? And it's literally the end of your world, is the consequence of some of these choices. Right now there's this coronavirus stuff. I don't know, maybe somebody here has it. And we're here, and someone's gonna sneeze, and then we're all gonna get it. And then I don't know, 2% of you are gonna die. That's half of one person. Is that the way it works? Okay. Somebody's upset then. Okay. So if that's the way we're gonna read it, Let's look at this next verse and see if we can kind of tweak it a little bit. Look at verse 18. Then the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him." And then he makes the animals, he gives the animals names. We talked about that last week. But then go to verse 20 at the end of it. But for the man there was not found a helper fit for him.
Are we still in Genesis 3?
Yeah, Genesis 2. Genesis 2:20, sorry. This is another place where the Hebrew is a little bit different than our English translation is suggesting. The Hebrew here says, "I will make a helper opposed to him." Opposite him. Literally, the word is opposite him. I'm going to make a helper sort of on the other side. Now, we can read that and interpret it as a helper sort of walking along with him, a kind of partner. We were kind of talking about that last week. But the word itself can also imply opposition. And so what does it mean it's not good for the man to be alone? It's not that I don't want him to be lonely. It's that I kind of don't want him to be unopposed. It's not healthy for a human being to just sort of get everything he wants without consequences or without any kind of resistance. And so if those of you who are in relationships, whether sort of romantic, like you're dating or you're married, or even kind of like serious friendships or relationship with people in your family, what does it mean for somebody to have a kind of relationship based on humanity itself? It's not just I'm going to support you in everything you do. It's also I'm going to oppose you when you want to do something stupid. And that's built into the nature of relationships. You guys kind of feeling that? So that's a part of, that's an aspect of why it's not good for a man to be alone. So, man, let's go to, he does the rib thing. He takes the rib, and makes it into a woman, brought her to the man. Then the man said, okay, let's look at the speech that Adam makes when he sees Eve. Let's analyze this. Okay. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." Okay, first. Who do I want to pick on? What a victim. Jason. You're always a good victim. Isn't Jason a good victim?
Sacrificing.
Don't you think that Jason feels awkward right now that I'm speaking about him in the third person when he's right there? Isn't that an awkward thing to do to somebody? This guy over here must feel so awkward right now because I am talking about him instead of actually talking to him. Don't you feel awkward?
Oh, great.
Yeah. That's exactly what Adam did. You guys see that? This at last is bone of... She's right in front of you, dude. Right in front of him, and he's like, "This at last. This at this." Guys, please. I do not want to have to do marriage counseling. Do not call your wife this. Okay? At last is bone of my... So he's speaking about her in the third person, not to her. There's this funny thing that happens.
He's checking her, right?
He doesn't speak to her here. He does speak to her at some point, but one of the commentators I was reading notices that she actually never speaks to him. I mean, it doesn't say that she never speaks to him, but we don't have any quotes about anything she says to him, which is kind of interesting. Okay, I don't want to build an argument on silence, but it's sort of you shrug your shoulders and say, okay, that's maybe she's giving him the silent treatment or something like that. Okay. Second, This at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken on of man. So his naming of Eve is self-referential. It's self-centered. So we don't have this, the sin is not committed yet. And yet selfishness is already kind of there, built into the very way that Adam is speaking about Eve. He is naming her according to himself, which is making himself the center of the picture here. Okay. And so, let me make a kind of a note, a sort of passing note about naming. The way that human beings name things, sometimes we can approach a kind of objective external understanding of what a thing is. You know, that's the goal of science, for example. The goal of science is to describe nature as it really is, to describe the world as it really is. What really is water? You know, and so they describe what water is in different ways. Okay, what is it that water can become snow? And they're approaching what we would call an objective description of nature. And sometimes when we name things or describe them, that's what we're doing. Other times, though, it's really just what this thing is in relation to me. And there's, you know that story, Alice in Wonderland? You ever watch that? There's a movie, a Disney movie. You ever read the book? It's a great book. The author is Lewis Carroll. He was kind of a weirdo, kind of a creep actually. Don't read about him, but his writings are fun to read because he was also a logic teacher, and he also wrote logic textbooks. So there's all kinds of little logic jokes built into Alice in Wonderland. If you read it carefully, it's really interesting. So one of the jokes is this, that there's Alice like takes one of these pills and she gets really tall, like her neck and her limbs get really long, and so she's looking down and there's like a whole forest underneath her, and then this pigeon comes and like attacks her in the face, and the pigeon starts calling her a snake. You're a serpent. You're a serpent. She's like, I'm not a serpent. I'm a little girl. He's like, I've never seen a little girl with a neck like that, you know, and this pigeon is all upset because she thinks that Alice is going to eat her eggs. You know, she just laid eggs and she keeps getting upset because these snakes keep eating her eggs. And she's like, you're denying that you're a serpent. I bet not next you're going to say that you don't eat eggs. And then Alice is like, no, I do eat eggs. I do. And then the pigeon says, well, if you eat eggs, then you're just a serpent. You're the same as a serpent. What does that indicate? It means that this pigeon is defining Alice only according to itself. As far as I'm concerned, I don't care what you are. If you eat eggs, you're a serpent. If you eat eggs, that means you're a threat to me, and I need to attack you with my wings. So we do that, we define things according to ourselves when we are self-centered or when we're being sort of particularly human and non-scientific. And so pay attention to this, because a lot of times we forget that we're doing that. And we think that what you are in your life and your world is nothing other than what you are to me, which is a limitation of who you are. Okay, and we can do that to each other, like in relationships. And you know, a husband will consider his wife, or a wife will consider her husband nothing other than the way he appears to her, or she appears to him, and that can cause very serious trouble. Now, the advice that I want to give you is this: if really we are made in God's image, as it says in this last chapter of Genesis, and if God is a being who's always going to be mysterious to us and beyond our understanding, that means we're always going to be a little bit mysterious to each other. And a big piece of advice that I like to give people that are beginning a marriage or beginning a relationship is always leave a little bit of mystery. Never, ever, ever assume that you know everything about somebody, because you can't. There's always going to be more to them than you know. And the minute you forget that and define them only according to your own knowledge of them, bad things will happen. Because you're going to make assumptions that are going to end up being false. You know what I mean? You're going to make guesses that are going to end up kind of coming back to haunt you later. You guys get that? That seems to be right to me. I hope, I don't know, might help somebody someday.
But
Okay.
if when you're married, you're actually becoming a human. So why would you keep secrets?
I'm not saying to keep secrets.
Well,
No, not at all. Sorry, no. Did anybody get that impression?
No.
Just you again. No.
Because I'm smarter.
Yeah, maybe you're smarter. Or maybe something else. However, you're actually the right
Actually,
question.
it's my background in IT, so I like to ask about.
Yeah, I appreciate that. No, I'm not at all implying to keep secrets. I'm saying, don't ever make assumptions about the other one.
Okay.
Yeah, keep the mystery, I guess you could, keep the mystery, I don't mean keep yourself a mystery. I'm saying keep the other person a mystery. Never think that you know everything about them. And always ask rather than assume, maybe that's a better way to say it. Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Wes.
So, earlier, right, verse 18 where it says, will make a helper suitable for him,
Mhm.
and then when Adam says, this is now bone in my bones, how does the context go from that to, this is why a man leaves his father and mother, when they weren't really...
So the narrator is connecting what Adam says here with the marital act, and clings to his wife, and they both become one flesh. And the man, so the idea is this. I don't want to get too graphic here, but as the rib was taken out of Adam, and so Eve was sort of made out of that rib. So originally, what was one body connected thing, well, the marital act is going to be kind of a reversal of that. You know what I mean? Okay. Can we stop talking about this now?
Yeah. Get talking.
So no more awkwardness. And the man and his wife were both naked. That's also awkward. And not ashamed. I think that has everything to do with this. They were living a life of instinct rather than of self-awareness or of consciousness, sort of self-consciousness. And so, I don't know, you guys ever feel this way? Like, you're just kind of having a conversation with somebody, and then somebody points out something awkward about what you did, and then you feel self-conscious, and now you're really awkward. You ever do that? That happens to me all the time. I know I'm an awkward person. I used to, I scratch my face a lot, especially when I get nervous, and everyone's like, yeah, obviously you do. I didn't know that I did that. And I was just innocently, I would be preaching or whatever, and then afterwards somebody's like, oh, you scratch your face a lot. And then ever since that day, that was like 13 years ago, I'm like really self-conscious about it. And then I forgot about it, and now I just reminded myself.
You know what would make it easier? You could shave it.
No, I was doing it before I had a beard.
Oh,
Yeah, that's what's amazing. Yeah, I didn't have a beard until I moved here. This was when I was still in Michigan,
okay.
and I was doing a funeral, and it was this really sad funeral. I was really nervous, like it was a really tragic, like it was a death. It was like an accident. It was just horrible. So I'm preaching at this funeral, and apparently I was doing this a lot because when I'm nervous, I do it more. Apparently, now you guys are all going to watch me more. You guys all have nervous things too.
doing
and-
it, you're like, I'm just nervous.
It makes me nervous, man. I don't want to get corona from you guys. Anyway, scratch my face real quick. Talked about that. Oh, okay. This last thing about naming, and then I'll start to slow down. This last thing about naming is when it's not done in this sort of attempted to be done in this kind of scientific way of I'm going to really try to learn what this thing is and just describe it in itself. You're actually saying more about yourself. Now let me say this. So for example, I have had the misfortune of doing a lot of marriage counseling when the issue was adultery, was cheating. And that's one of the hardest things to deal with. And sometimes it isn't actually happening. And the wife or the husband will say to the other one, and this all happened in front of me, it's horrible. Will say to the other, yeah, there's a coworker that they flirt with all the time that they're sneaking around behind my back and they're hiding it from me and they're saying all this, and then the other one's like, nothing like that has ever happened. And he or she has no evidence of this. And sometimes an accusation actually reveals itself to be a confession. What you accuse others to be is what you're worried that you might be yourself. So when the person is pointing the finger, when you point a finger, you have 3 fingers pointing back at you or whatever. Unless you go like this, you should point it. Sometimes that's not always, by no means is this universal, but an overly suspicious person might be in that suspiciousness revealing the fact that maybe they're not really worthy of trust. You know what I mean? Sometimes, I mean, other times it's because they've been betrayed in the past and they're kind of scarred from that, so don't take this as universal. But in this case, so Adam is sort of telling us something about himself. What do we know about Eve? When Adam names her woman because she was taken out of man, did we learn anything new about Eve when he names her that way? No, we already knew that. We already knew that she was taken out of man. So his naming of her had no interesting content about Eve. It didn't tell us anything about Eve, but it told us a lot about Adam. It told us that Adam was self-centered in the way he named her. So the way that Adam is speaking is telling us about himself, even though his object or his topic is Eve. You guys see that? So.
But he gave up a rib. Why would he be selfish?
Oh, he didn't give it up. God put him to sleep and took it.
Yeah, I was just
Yeah, he was not willing.
So he had no choice.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe he would have said, no, it's my favorite rib.
Did he have a choice when he ate the fruit? Or did he
We'll get to that.
just wanted to be
We'll
lonely?
get there, but
He
yes.
wanted to be lonely?
We'll get there. I knew that.
Yeah, we'll get to the choice thing, yeah. At the very least, let's put it this way.
Yes.
The analysis of Eve's sin is one thing, but Adam's sin is a whole different story. And there's a lot more, it's actually a much more interesting and kind of a dark story there. So next week is we're gonna really dive into the sin part. Jason?
Was it, I read something that it wasn't necessarily a sleep, but a vision, that Adam had a vision, that God was doing this to him?
Where'd you read that?
Oh, it comes from the translation of the word, deep sleep.
Yeah?
That in itself is I can't recall.
I will look into that and get back to you because I'm not aware of it. But I'll look in, I was looking at the Hebrew yesterday because of another reason. Oh, because of this middle of the tree, I was looking for that word. And how the phrasing is in Hebrew. I thought maybe the English lost it, but it's not. So I'll look into that and I'll get back to you next week. I'll keep trying to remember to bring the Hebrew with me to class, but whatever. All right.
Of course.
So next week, sexuality and the eating of the fruit. Okay, that's what we're gonna start talking about next week. Okay. Any questions or comments or anything about topic today, or in general, any like Q&A stuff? Yeah.
On the whole, like, death part, is it that Adam and Eve just were immortal, or is it that they just weren't aware of their death? Like
Yeah, that's-
like an animal is.
I think that might be what was happening. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure, I mean, now that you mentioned animals, that's an interesting question. Are animals aware of their mortality? I think maybe some are, because they seem to fight and like be scared of things and run away when, you know what I mean? There might be some kind of basic awareness, but that's a different topic, that's different than your question.
I feel like to be aware of your death, you have to be aware of time. I don't know if animals are really that.
Oh, I think animals are aware of the passage of time. Time, I mean, not in this, again, not in the same way that human beings are. I don't think they could describe it or measure it in the way we do, but certainly, you know, Siduri notices
They relate
when
to the
Father
sun.
Andy, Siduri's my cat, you know, Siduri's my cat. Siduri notices Father Andy's here and then he's not here, you know. Actually, she doesn't care about me now. She has these seminarians, she loves Chris, because he's nice to her. And I always like tease her and annoy her, so like she doesn't like me as much. Anyway. Okay. I don't know what your question was, but I feel like I answered it. I feel satisfied. Next question. What else you got? Yeah.
Is there a Bible that's more accurate to the Hebrew? Because I feel like a lot of these readings
Yeah.
can go either way depending
Yeah.
on how you interpret it.
The two that seem to be the most popular are the one that I'm using, which is the RSV, and then there's one called the ESV. I don't know what this is the Revised Standard Version. I don't know what this one stands for, but this one is had just come out. There's a Catholic edition of the ESV that just came out that Augustine Institute printed. One of my good friends works there. They're saying this one's sort of the new good one. Although I think this one's fine. The one I'm using is the RSV, is this Ignatius Study Bible thing. So yeah, those are the two that I like. But what's good about Bible translations is that there's like thousands of them, so you can always compare. If one of them doesn't quite sound right, you can always kind of look back, even if you don't know Hebrew that well.
I'm still having difficulties understanding the difference between the tree of knowledge and then the tree of life.
Okay.
I know that the tree of knowledge, it helps you know good and bad, or good and evil. And that's why they covered themselves up when they were naked. They said, okay, this is bad, so I'm gonna cover myself up. So they learned about the good and the bad. But the life, the knowledge of life, what would that make them?
Tree of life, not knowledge of life. It seems, somebody had mentioned this earlier, it seems like it would have made them immortal. It would have made them never die.
Okay, but
Yeah.
then he said in the Bible that he was gonna kill them if they did eat the fruits.
Yeah, and the way that that's played out is he kicks them out of the garden to take them away from the tree of life.
That's when they gave,
That's
that's when
when-
he gave him
Mortality.
eviction?
Yeah.
Basically?
That's when he fulfilled that sentence, yeah.
But, okay, that goes back to the knowledge of good and bad, but then the life is, they live forever? How is
Yeah.
that bad?
No, it's not bad.
Okay,
It's bad to not have that.
so he
That's
told
ideal.
them not to eat from that tree
Yeah.
for a reason.
Yeah.
So they can live forever,
He told them not to eat from this tree.
and also from the tree
No.
of life.
There's no command about that one.
I thought you
No.
said, last week you said that he did.
No.
When you pulled out the grapefruit, and I said that's part of the tree of life, and.
Oh, I misheard you then. This is the one they said not to eat
Well,
from.
you did respond back and said, no.
I take
that's-
that back if that's what I said. But these are all recorded, so I have
Yeah,
evidence.
okay.
But yeah, no,
But
but
we can see it on YouTube?
yeah, those are all on YouTube. This guy posts them all the time.
Oh, nice.
I actually have people like have come up to me like, oh yeah, I watch them. So good job.
I got
What's-
people in
what's the
Australia
link
that
on that?
always literally, like, my family went to Australia, everybody literally commented, oh, yeah, Andrew's doing a good job, I love this stuff.
They went to what?
My family went to Australia.
Oh,
And
Australia.
all the people over there, like they just, I guess they heard of you now.
Yeah, so hi everybody online. I'm even more self-conscious now. I also started a blog, which makes me hate myself.
One step closer to a podcast.
I will never have a podcast.
You said you never had a blog either, but.
No, I never said I never had a blog. I thought about doing a blog for years. I just didn't want to do it, and then a publisher told me because I'm trying to publish some books, and a publisher emailed me back and said, "Good proposal. I like this. It's solid content. It's impossible to get published if you don't already have a big audience that you can sort of point to and say these are people that might buy my book." And this is the only way to do it. So I hate myself, but I have to do it. It is a necessary evil.
So
Bad. It's bad. It's not immoral. It's just lousy.
You
Yeah.
said next week we're gonna talk about sex. What's the homework on it?
Please do not. That's actually a good joke. I like that. Can we appreciate that? Please do not do any experiments between now and next week. Go ahead, Jason.
Is there anything that you know in regarding to sort of like the topography of the Garden of Eden and where, like, I heard that it's a mountain and then the trees at the bottom. Something that where, okay.
Sorry, I'm picking my teeth. Is that rude? Sorry. No, the most I've heard about topography is that there are people that divide it between trees, and then which are in the middle, and then you have the garden, and then the garden is in Eden. It's not the Garden of Eden. There's a verse that says in. So there's Eden, and so there's this sort of three-part structure, and some commentators are saying this is parallel to the three-part structure of the temple, where you have the court of the Gentiles, and then the holy place,
Which is at the highest point.
and then you have the Holy of Holies. I mean, it's vertical, it's like horizontal. I don't know if it's high or low.
I thought someone goes up and brings it down.
Here?
Yeah, in the
I
temple.
don't know.
Okay.
But the three-part structure, maybe it's vertical, I don't know. But the three-part structure is, you have the holiest place, and then here, the Holy of Holies, and then the holy place, and then the temple, like sort of the court. So some commentators are saying, the whole Adam is a priest thing. So Adam is a priest, and this is his temple, and there's this, and then he was sort of kicked out of this sort of temple, and they had to. So there's a whole story behind that. Yeah. So the vertical aspect, I'm not very aware of. You might be right about that.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to, because last week you were talking about how there's a few words that relate to Adam being a priest, and so
Yeah.
that is,
This is that's right. This is related to that. Yeah. This part of it is really interesting, I just don't know much about it. This is, my friends are experts on this stuff, but it's not something that I'm very well read on. How you guys doing? What's next? We have 8 minutes.
I don't think really. Were you gonna talk about choice today, or that's next week?
Next week we're gonna see the consequences of this.
On the choices?
Yeah. I'm not sure what else to say about it.
If humans are primitive without choice, then why would you think they would be made without choice initially?
No, so that's the way the story is saying it is, it's not that they were made without choice. It's that the consequences of this choice are all of these other sort of, the consequence of choice is self-awareness, let's put it that way. So humanity originally has a capacity for that. And when it's sort of put into, when it's sort of activated, is when all this stuff kind of happens. So again, if we're gonna read this story as not necessarily a kind of sequential thing, but as a kind of a cause and effect thing. Here, it's not that before we were just sort of instinctual and non-conscious, then we made this choice and now we're self-conscious and we're no longer innocent in the same way. It's not about before or then. I suppose in life it is that way when we're little tiny kids and then we start to have to kind of make choices. But I'm not sure that's even the case with kids because it seems like toddlers, I don't know, it doesn't seem like choice is this kind of black and white thing. They sort of like do stuff and then they get yelled at or whatever, and they kind of gradually grow to sort of say, oh, there's good and bad, and you know what I mean? So, I forgot your question. Oh, so it's not about before and after necessarily, it's more about this, the reason why we become self-conscious is because we make decisions, and sometimes our decisions are dumb, and we have to pay the price for them, and so on.
But we wouldn't be like very different from animals if it wasn't for self-awareness.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So
So here's the thing, this is not, remember, it's good and bad, it's not good and evil.
Yeah.
So none of this is up to us. We don't get to choose whether or not to have free will. And that's kind of what your question's about. It's not as if we have an option, and it's not as if we can kind of get back to Eden and just become non-conscious beings. You can't do that, and that's not the goal. In fact, the book of Genesis from this point on is going to show we have to make our best with this situation, but we can't undo it. Okay. At most, the closer we can get on this earth to undoing it is in Christ, who undid the sin of Adam and brings us back to our, the sort of innocence. But that doesn't mean we no longer have to make choices. You know what I mean? So the opposite of this is willing obedience. Okay, which is going to be something that we're going to have to talk about next week in the context of the eating of the fruit.
So you would say you would say that like what Adam and Eve did was probably necessary.
I don't
for
think it's
humans
possible.
to be
Yeah.
humans. Yeah. Okay.
And that's why I think it's appropriate that the consequences were not really punishments, they were just natural things.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, it was still disobedience though, you know? And so I think that's also necessary then, because once you create a being with free will, you create not only the possibility, but the probability, maybe even the necessity of disobedience.
Yeah. They were given God's grace, and after the sin, we have to earn God's grace. Makes sense?
Nope.
Prayer.
You can't earn God's grace,
No.
you can't earn it. Free.
But then
It's
you know,
free.
that's why you pray and. You do
It's not to
that.
earn it though,
Okay.
it's to ask for it like a beggar,
Okay.
yeah.
God created animals and birds. Did they eat the tree from the tree of wisdom? And when would
That's a
that
good
be-
question, I don't know.
Did they eat first?
So because they're not capable of choice, and again, we're reading this in a non-literal way,
Okay,
because they're not capable of a choice, I don't think they're able to.
so what would have happened if they ate them? Nothing?
I think they would have been fine.
Does that talk about the concept of guilt? Like, Adam and Eve ever feel guilty or remorseful for
So the very initial thing they feel is shame, which I think is related to guilt. Yeah. Now, it's the initial shame they feel, we're going to get into this more next week, is of their own nakedness. So here, in this original sort of state, they're naked and not ashamed. What does it mean to feel shame and awareness of nakedness? That's one of the big things we're going to talk about next week. At the very least, it has to do with awareness of your vulnerability. You know. So, and then we'll talk about the leaves and all that stuff. There's a lot of cool stuff to say about that. That story. And maybe I'll even answer the question that you had asked a few weeks ago about why was it an apple or whatever you asked.
Nice.
Yeah. But maybe I won't. Just
So what is it, yes or no?
Okay, well, let's say a prayer.